For over 100 years, battles have raged in the air for command of the skies.
If you don't have air supremacy, you're in trouble.
Since its earliest beginnings in World War I, the airplane is the supreme weapon of the armed forces.
This was a real battle for civilization, for humanity.
It revolutionized battle and changed the ways war was fought and won.
The F-117 has obviously changed how we design aircraft and air campaigns.
War drove innovation in the skies.
What we hear from the Air Force is when the F-35 wasn't there, all others died. When F-35 was there, they reigned supreme.
Aircraft bred a new kind of hero. The fate of entire nations depended on the bravery of a handful of men.
An appreciation of the extent to which young men were willing to put their lives on the line for an ideal is something we need to remember more often than we do.
In this episode, bandits, secrets, and spies. The planes that fought using stealth and spy technology. All warfare is based on deception. To strike effectively, it's essential to know your opponent, who they are, and where they are.
As with all warfare, from the dawn of time until the 21st century, information is power.
The Blackbird is the fastest aircraft ever built.
It pretty much was impervious to enemy air defenses.
At a blistering Mach 3, it was back on home turf before the enemy even realized it had been compromised.
So the capabilities of the SR-71 camera systems were absolutely astonishing.
As the military took flight, so did the art of surveillance.
The British tended to use substantial numbers of airplanes to do reconnaissance over the lines.
Pioneers in aerial photography turned the Rumpler Taube into the world's first spy plane.
The Germans experimented with multiple different colours and patterns to counteract the aircraft being seen from overhead, from observation balloons, and in reverse from the ground or from the trenches.
The U-2 plane broke new records in aviation, flying higher than any plane before it.
Their target was to carry out strategic reconnaissance of the Soviet Union. It's illegal for an aeroplane to violate a sovereign airspace's territory.
Enter the ultra-secret world of stealth.
The F-117 pilots were collectively known as bandits.
Stealing into the night was the Nighthawk, the world's first stealth bomber.
It was able to drop bombs without anybody knowing they were coming. And so they unleashed not only surprise on the enemy, but they also had a psychological effect that the bombs were coming from nowhere.
Stealth is a world where you can steal an opponent's secrets and disappear in the blink of an eye. It's the 1950s. Tensions are running high as the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union deepens. Both sides knew little about each other's nuclear capability. Ignorance fueled paranoia.
The Soviet Union was 8.5 million square miles, so it's a vast area, very difficult to gain information. And so before satellites, that was extremely difficult to collect information.
Espionage intensified. Spies were pitted against spies. The Soviet Union operated behind a wall of secrecy and isolated itself from the rest of the world. They called it the Iron Curtain.
The Soviet Union was still a big unknown. Were the Soviets developing strategic bombers that could reach the US and deliver a nuclear weapon?
But this was 1953. And the US had no aircraft capable of gathering the vitally needed intelligence. So a little-known British bomber was pressed into service.
It is the original high-altitude spy plane. Before the U-2 ever came off the drawing boards, the CIA went to the British and asked them if they couldn't get this Canberra to fly higher than the current flight that was doing 50,000 feet or so.
The English Electric Canberra first flew in May 1949. And it was so successful, they increased the wingspan quite dramatically, which enabled it to get much, much higher in order to conduct reconnaissance missions over denied territory.
So the British modified it by putting Rolls-Royce Avon Mark 109s in it, and we're surprised to find out it would do 65,000 feet.
Codenamed Project Robin, the English electric Canberra's mission was to overfly Russia's Kapustin Yar missile range.
In those days, they didn't know what the Russian ballistic missiles could do, and they needed to know, what kind of progress they had made. They needed photographs of them.
It was equipped with cameras and therefore gathered in the main photographic intelligence, and it also had a variety of recorders on board to gather electronic intelligence.
The mission objectives were just to take pictures of the launch area and the rockets that were on the launch area. This is the aircraft that flew that mission.
Larry Champion was part of the Canberra's aircrew.
We used to fly with formation, for example. We would fly here and the bad guys would fly here. They'd try to shoot us down and they would come up like so and stall out. Those who knew aircraft know what stalling is. But we were relatively safe at 65,000 feet.
Russia and America engaged in a deadly nuclear arms race, each building up stocks of intercontinental ballistic missiles to strike at a moment's notice. The concept of mutually assured destruction maintained a precarious peace between both sides. But maintaining a fragile truce depended on good intel.
The intelligence was most important to keep the mutual assured destruction was the colloquialism of the day, and that was the idea that we knew that what they had, they knew what we had, and therefore the Cold War stayed cold, yes.
Canberra's missions were flown by the RAF. America needed its own aircraft. In 1954, President Eisenhower approved the ultra-secret project, the U-2.
It was the kind of thing that the US kept wraps on, particularly because it was going to be ideally penetrating Soviet airspace. They didn't admit to its existence.
It was a covert operation for good reason.
As you probably know, it's illegal for an aeroplane to violate a sovereign airspace's territory.
Development of the U-2 became a CIA project led by Agency Chief Richard M. Bissell Jr.
The U-2 was designed to fly over the Soviet Union and to not be detected. And to do that, it had to fly very high, higher than any airplane had previously flown.
And this one is certainly unique because you're flying at the very edge of the stratosphere, wearing a full pressure suit, flying over maybe some unfriendly territory or areas that puts you, the pilot, in some very difficult situations that you have to deal with on your own.
Flying the U-2 at its operational altitude of 70,000 feet is extremely hazardous.
The fastest you could go in an airplane was only a few knots different from the slowest you could fly.
Pilots call it coffin corner. Fly too slow or too fast, and the plane goes into an uncontrollable dive.
So the pilot had to fly the plane between a window of only about 7 or 8 knots at the very highest altitudes.
The U-2 boasted a new large format camera, measuring 15 feet long by 13 inches in diameter. It had an unprecedented resolution of 2.5 feet from an altitude of 11 miles high.
All of our imagery is rated on a national scale, so it can be compared to something maybe a satellite can see.
Despite the need for vital military intelligence, President Eisenhower became concerned that overflights of the Soviet Union might cause a war.
He knew what a provocation these flights were, and although he was an ex-military man himself, he was a very careful president.
The CIA reassured the president that Soviet radar could not track high-altitude U-2 flights.
In 1956, President Eisenhower gave the CIA permission to fly for 10 days, and they could launch as many flights as they liked at that time. But the big surprise and the big disappointment was that the Soviets tracked those flights. They identified them on radar.
These were black ops, secret and covert operations arranged by the government. So if the plane was shot down, the CIA took steps to ensure that the pilots couldn't be taken alive.
When the U-2 first started flying over the Soviet Union in 1956, the pilots were given a means to commit suicide in the form of cyanide pills.
They faced a stark choice: capture or suicide.
Legend has it that one of the pilots who took out sweets with him nearly mistook the suicide pill for one of his candies. But it really is a legend because the U-2 pilots were encased in a pressure suit and a pressure helmet.
The CIA took steps to make sure there were no mistakes.
The CIA later changed from the pills to a rather clever disguised cyanide-tipped needle and hiding it inside a silver dollar because they just simply thought the Russians would not discover that, whereas they might have discovered the suicide pills.
The U-2 pilots prepare to overfly hostile Russian territory. U-2 operations to spy on the Soviet Union began in 1956. And one pilot in particular would soon embark on a top-secret mission that would stretch US-Russia relations to breaking point. It's the height of the Cold War. Both sides unleash their spies to discover the secrets of their opponent. The US developed stealth technology as part of its armory. Although the Soviets could track the U-2 in the northern parts of its territory, the Russians weren't aware that Moscow and Leningrad had been photographed. The photographs also showed MiG fighters scrambling to intercept the U-2. American President Eisenhower was worried.
He knew what a provocation these flights were, and although he was an ex-military man himself, he was a very careful president. He never again gave the CIA carte blanche permission to fly a series of missions.
By the end of the 1950s, tensions reached breaking point between the US and Soviet Russia. Cold War rhetoric threatened nuclear war. Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev boasted that a Soviet missile could deliver a 5-megaton warhead 8,000 miles away. America needed to know the facts.
Could they launch intercontinental ballistic missiles from their own territory over the pole and onto US targets?
Even though the CIA knew that the Soviets could spot the American U-2 planes on their radar, the missions continued.
They knew that they could still outfly the missiles, i.e. the altitude of the U-2 was sufficient that the Soviet surface-to-air missiles couldn't quite reach them. So they were still able to fly this aircraft without being intercepted. Even if the Soviets could actually detect them, they weren't able to do anything about it.
Gary Powers was chosen for Operation Grand Slam. He was their most experienced pilot, with a record of 27 successful missions. But this mission would be different.
Unlike the previous missions, which launched and recovered to the same base, this was going to be a mission that's going to fly all the way across the Soviet Union, launching from Pakistan, but landing in Norway.
The flight plan was scheduled for May the 1st. This would prove to be a mistake.
The date of May 1st was problematic for the mission simply because it's a Soviet holiday, it's May Day. That meant there was very little air traffic at the time. As a result, then any flight, any incursion to Soviet airspace was that much more noticeable.
The Soviets began tracking the U-2 15 miles outside its border.
He reached a point 3.5 hours into his mission over Sverdlovsk, where the Soviet Union had a significant number of their new surface-to-air missiles, the SA-2.
The Soviets targeted their SA-2 surface-to-air missiles on Gary Powers.
They launched a total of 8 missiles that day from 3 different sites, and just one of those missiles nearly reached the U-2.
The missile had a proximity fuse designed to explode when it got close to its target.
One of the missiles that had engaged the U-2 of Gary Powers then explodes near the aircraft, knocking off one of the wings, making it unflyable.
Powers had no choice but to bail.
The G-forces were pinning him forward in the plane, and he realized that if he tried to eject, he'd probably have his legs cut off by the canopy rail because he was pressed forward.
So he opened the canopy and was sucked out and then dangling by his oxygen cord. He was desperately trying to free himself while the plane was in free fall and was unable as a result to hit the self-destruct button.
The dying U-2 was still loaded with spy cameras and incriminating film. But the CIA had made contingency plans for a crash.
There were a set of destruct switches in the cockpit which would operate an explosive charge to disable the camera and its film, so that hopefully, even though the wreckage would break up, that was a big camera, but the evidence that it had been taking pictures would be destroyed by this explosive charge. But those switches were beyond his reach as he bailed out of the plane.
Powers survived the missile strike and was quickly captured. The crash didn't completely destroy the U-2, and the Soviets were able to identify much of the equipment.
So initially it was thought that he probably had not survived the crash. Information didn't come out immediately that he had survived this.
On the 3rd of May, NASA announced that one of its aircraft making a high-altitude weather research flight in Turkey was missing. Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev remained silent. The Americans stuck to their story. On May the 7th, the Russians paraded Gary Powers to the world and revealed that he confessed to spying on the Soviet Union. The US was caught in a lie.
They had to admit the missions. So Eisenhower has to make a public statement. It was essentially unprecedented at the time, saying that yes, we have conducted these missions.
Premier Khrushchev had no hesitation in exposing America's spy operation to the world's press.
They wanted to put him on trial, a show trial, all part of Khrushchev's big propaganda effort to exploit this incident for all it was worth.
Gary Powers' trial began on the 17th of August 1960. He apologized to the Soviets and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Just 2 years later, on the 10th of February 1962, as part of a deal, the Soviets handed him over at Glienka Bridge between West Berlin and Potsdam, Germany. More than 50 years after its first flight, the U-2 remains in frontline service.
The U-2 designed in the 50s, first flight in 1955. Certainly not the same aircraft that our grandfathers would have flown. This one's now the S model.
But in the age of satellites, is the U-2 still relevant?
We are relevant because of our dynamic retasking. Satellites are very expensive to maneuver. It can be deployed anywhere in the world, for the most part, certainly the Middle East, then over in the Pacific theaters is where we operate mostly.
The U-2 flies high, but it is not stealthy. To combat modern radar systems, covert operations demand stealth aircraft.
Return to stealth as much as possible to try and gain that information.
For the Americans, gathering secrets from the Soviets meant creating a new plane with cutting-edge stealth technology.
They decided to turn to a much faster aircraft that could fly even higher.
The CIA set to work. In the cloak and dagger world of espionage, its very existence was kept a closely guarded secret for 10 years. Even its construction team was sworn to secrecy, and its design was revolutionary. They developed the first modern stealth plane, the Lockheed Martin A-12.
The A-12 is really one of the benchmarks of early stealth technology. So it was very important at the time to fly really high, really fast, but to have a really reduced radar cross-section.
It was made of new materials.
Well, the design challenges for the A-12 and essentially the SR-71 were significant because the parameters that they were designing for were far in excess of any current fighter aircraft. So the speeds that they were talking about were double the speeds of the contemporary fighter aircraft.
Powered by the J-58 turbojet engine, the A-12 was fast too.
This was the largest turbojet engine of its day, and that was what was required to get this airplane up to Mach 3.
And it was designed to be able to use its afterburner for significant periods where most fighter aircraft had maybe a minute on afterburner at maximum speed.
Some people say it's as fast as a bullet, but 3 times the speed of sound.
over 2,000 miles an hour is pretty quick.
The A-12 was fitted with the latest surveillance technology.
Well, the big thing for the A-12 was the cameras it carried. There was 3 different types of cameras used, and they were able to capture swaths of land between 40 miles wide and almost 70 miles wide with a resolution down to 12 inches from 70,000 feet. So it was quite remarkable cameras that were used and carried by this airplane.
In 1968, the A-12 was put to the test when North Korea sparked an international crisis known as the Pueblo Incident.
That's when North Korea, doing their saber rattling, went and captured a U.S. ship that was on a spy mission in international waters, the USS Pueblo.
The ship was boarded and was taken into tow by the North Koreans. It was very important for the US intelligence community to understand what was going on here.
America was already embroiled in the Vietnam War. Now there was the prospect of another conflict opening up with North Korea. The only way to prevent it was to bring in the A-12 to see what the regime was really up to.
If it was more than saber rattling, if they captured this ship as part of a bigger operation to maybe invade the South Korean peninsula, there was a whole nother war going on. They wanted to accomplish 3 things: find the Pueblo, determine where the crew may be held, but more importantly, determine if the North Korean military was mobilizing for a bigger conflict.
Just 3 days later, a mission was scheduled out of Kadena with the A-12, a Black Shield sortie, and it flew 3 passes over North Korea.
And they were able to prove, with just 3 overflights of A-12s, that the North Korean military was not mobilizing, and they can allow diplomatic processes to get the crew back. It took 11 months, but they did get the crew back. But we avoided that bigger war.
It proved the technology. It proved that triple sonic reconnaissance worked.
I would say that the A-12 not only changed the course of history in that area, but maybe prevented a larger war. And once you're dealing with the North Koreans, you're dealing with the Chinese. So if we had gone off a little half-cocked with the North Koreans during the Pueblo incident and maybe attacked them, things might be very, very different today and not very good.
By the 1960s, global tensions threatened to descend into all-out war. The development of stealth technology offers a vital lifeline to keep the peace. Enter the Blackbird, generally regarded as America's most successful spy plane.
The SR-71 has a much bigger sensor suite. It could carry a number of different kinds of sensors that included cameras, electronic intelligence gathering, infrared cameras. The SR-71 was particularly effective because of its speed and its altitude, so nothing could actually catch it.
The Lockheed SR-71 was a pure reconnaissance aircraft. It was triple sonic, so therefore it would cruise in afterburner at Mach 3.2. That's about 2,200 miles an hour.
The Blackbird is the fastest plane ever made, period. But breaking aviation records almost broke the plane.
The other problems were at that altitude and at those speeds with the temperatures. So the skin of the aircraft, depending on where you're talking about on the aircraft, would be anything from 250 to something like 550 degrees.
At Mach 3, the heat generated from air friction alone would simply melt the plane mid-air.
So they had to find new solutions, and things like aluminum structures simply weren't up to the task, so they had to turn to new materials such as titanium. The interesting side story is that the titanium reserves in the US were actually quite insignificant, and most of this titanium could be found in the Soviet Union. So they had to use third parties and front companies as a sort of subterfuge to manage to get enough titanium to build the A-12 and the SR-71. So the Soviet Union actually helps build the SR-71 and the A-12.
The SR-71 flew on the edge of space at a record-breaking altitude of 85,000 feet. From 15 miles high, the Blackbird's camera photographed targets in astonishing detail. Jim Shelton was one of the first pilots to fly the Blackbird SR-71.
One of the photos that I specifically remember was a young boy, and you could see his leg. He's playing soccer in North Vietnam, and his leg is up, and the ball is just coming off of his leg.
The capabilities of the SR-71 camera systems were absolutely astonishing.
It was the perfect spy in the sky. Stealthy, secret, and quick.
The SR-71 is a 35-mile-a-minute aircraft. You don't have to worry about being shot down with a surface-to-air missile.
The Blackbird could go where no other plane would dare fly.
It was an aircraft that could fly over heavily defended areas, and that's why it was selected to go ahead and fly the Yom Kippur missions in 1973.
October the 6th, 1973. The simmering tension between Egypt and Israel boils into all-out war. Soviet-backed Egypt and Syria attack Israel and invade the tiny state. The Middle East was the new front line in the Cold War. US-backed Israel vigorously defends itself against overwhelming odds. An Israeli defeat could lead to global nuclear conflict. The Soviets launch Cosmos 5, a spy satellite bringing them immediate intelligence from the battlefront, putting them ahead of the US.
The United States could not spare a satellite to put into orbit over that battlefield area. So instead they called upon the services of the SR-71.
The mission was called Operation Giant Reach.
Operation Giant Reach was an SR-71 mission over the Middle East during the 1973 war, and it was essentially to survey the area and see what the Israelis and the Arab forces, how they were configured and whether they were living up to some of the agreements they'd made in order to help broker a peace.
The original flight plan was just over 8 hours, which allowed the SR-71 to stop over in England to refuel and the crew to rest. But the British government had other ideas.
And the British said, you can't land here. We don't want to support anything going on in the Middle East because we rely so heavily on the Middle East oil. So instead of an 8.5-hour mission, we turned into an 11-hour and 20-minute mission flying out of New York.
It would be the longest mission a Blackbird had ever flown. In the early hours of October the 12th, Jim Shelton took off from Griffiths Air Force Base in New York on his vital intelligence gathering mission.
So you want to be over a target area somewhere between 11 and 1 o'clock to go ahead and get the brightest sun. Also, that allows the photo interpreters to have bits of shadows so that they can determine elevation, heights of buildings, and things of that nature.
Jim Shelton's mission was top secret. Neither the Egyptians nor the Israelis knew about it.
The intelligence officer said, don't be surprised if the Israelis or the Egyptians shoot at you.
Undaunted, the SR-71 entered Egyptian airspace and began photographing its armed forces. Jim Shelton's navigator, Gary Coleman, alerts Jim with urgent news.
So now as we're coming down the Suez, Gary tells me that the Egyptian surface-to-air missiles are tracking us.
It's not only the Egyptians that are tracking the Blackbird.
But as the US hadn't notified the Israelis, even though they were allies at this stage, the Israelis weren't aware of this, and any incursion in their airspace they fired on, so they did launch some surface-to-air missiles against the SR-71.
Jet fighters are scrambled to intercept the Blackbird.
Then we get towards Cairo area. I could look down and see contrails, but I couldn't tell exactly if those were Egyptian or Israeli contrails I could see below us.
But the Blackbird flew too high for the fighters to attack. Jim Shelton's crew began to photograph the region. The SR-71's nose camera can capture an entire country on film in just 1 hour, on 10,500 feet of film. Its mission provided vital intelligence that quite literally changed the world. It allowed the US to broker a peace deal between Egypt and Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir.
What I had heard was that the State Department advised Golda Meir that she was further into Egypt than she was letting the rest of the world know. And of course she wanted to know how, and they said, well, we've got this photo, here's the battle line, and there's no arguing against the photo that shows troops up so far into Egypt, and she backed up a little bit there when they finally signed their negotiating treaty.
In its 35-year service record, not one Blackbird SR-71 was lost, demonstrating just how far stealth ingenuity had come since its inception. Stealth technology has its roots back in World War I, when Germany's Rumpler-Taube aircraft experimented with camouflage.
You can barely see them when they come over the lines, and to try to position yourself to intercept them when they're coming back is almost impossible.
The Rumpler-Taube was used for reconnaissance. It was the first of its kind. It had a translucent fuselage, which made it very difficult for ground-based observers to detect.
The early Rumpler-Taubes were very, actually flimsy aircraft, and because of the nature of the linen covering the fuselage and the wings and the tail, they're almost invisible from the ground because it's like looking right through them if the sun is shining.
These reconnaissance aircraft also had an early form of stealth technology applied to their wings.
It's called the lozenge camouflage. The Germans experimented with multiple different colors and patterns to counteract the aircraft being seen from overhead, from observation balloons, and in reverse from the ground, from the trenches.
From the outset, aircraft proved its ability to capture vital intel through reconnaissance. In World War II, British radar technology brought even greater powers of intelligence gathering.
There were stations, hundreds of stations across the coast, all the way up from Scotland, all the way down the south coast as well. What was critical about the radars was that they were able to tell that something was coming in at what height, what distance, which direction it was travelling. So it was tracking something coming through and how many were coming in. So we needed to know how many bombers were coming in, how many Messerschmitts were coming in supporting those bombers, and therefore how many fighters and which squadrons we needed to get up into the air.
Both sides were in a race to develop the best radar systems. But as soon as one side gained an advantage, the other side found ways to block it. Germany had perfected a top-secret airborne radar system known as Liechtenstein, an aircraft-mounted radar that was state-of-the-art.
Okay, Liechtenstein radar is a German airborne radar that's used to detect, track, and then attack Allied bombers in the Allied bomber offensive. It's the mainstay of the German night fighters, and more advanced than the kind of designs that the Allies had at the time.
The struggle for dominance between Germany and Britain intensified as both sides engaged in a technological arms race. It's a constant battle between innovation in radar and stealth technology. May the 9th, 1943, on the German-occupied airfield of Aalborg, Denmark, Luftwaffe flying ace Heinrich Schmidt takes off in his Junkers with 2 other crewmen and disappears into the mist. The aircraft is one of the first 12 Junkers Ju-88 fitted with the new radar system. But Schmidt is not planning a raid. He's defecting. Pilot Heinrich Schmidt cannot reconcile his love of flying with the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign.
Schmidt was very disillusioned, I think, with the German regime at the time.
After a raid on the undefended Spanish town of Guernica, the pilots were taken on a visit to see the devastation they'd caused on the ground.
He was shown the devastation afterwards, a number of bodies of women and children, and then swore not to use air power again offensively, regardless of the kind of situation.
Schmidt was horrified.
And as a result, he was determined to defect and also hand then the British this copy of the Liechtenstein radar, hoping to at least give the British a leg up.
Schmidt had a fiancée, and she was Jewish. While he was away flying, she was taken to a concentration camp and executed. So Schmidt was determined to defeat the Nazis, whatever the cost. He began feeding intelligence reports to his father in Switzerland, a former German diplomat who had also rejected the Nazi cause. Helped by his father, he began to live 2 lives on the base, one as a pilot, the second as a spy. And help was close at hand.
The second crew member was Paul Rosenberg. He was partly Jewish, which is quite unusual in the Luftwaffe at the time, so he was also politically motivated to defect.
Schmidt's chance came when his crew was sent out on a sortie to shoot down an unarmed civilian Mosquito plane flying from Scotland to neutral Sweden. On May the 9th, 1943, they set off. They flew out towards the North Sea, keeping the aircraft below radar. A few miles from the Scottish coast, Schmidt appears on Allied radar, and 2 Spitfires are scrambled from RAF Dice. They're quickly intercepted, and Schmidt waggles his wingtips to announce their intention to surrender. Allied planes escort the Junkers back to the airfield. The prize Liechtenstein technology is handed to the Allied scientists. Schmidt and Rosenberger had given the British a vital advantage over the Luftwaffe. From its earliest beginnings, stealth technology has provided crucial intelligence to military commanders and world leaders. For nearly 80 years, spies ruled the skies, but the holy grail of invisibility eluded the US Air Force until the arrival of a game changer. The Lockheed F-117, otherwise known as the Nighthawk. But this wasn't just a spy plane. This one can take out the opposition.
The key combat role for the Nighthawk during Gulf War was attacking high-value and highly defended targets in the heart of Baghdad.
The Nighthawk was the world's first true stealth bomber.
Partly driving the need for stealth was the US experience in Vietnam, where they lost a lot of aircraft due to Soviet-controlled surface-to-air missiles in North Vietnam.
The program to develop the Nighthawk was a black ops project. Very few people in the Pentagon even knew it existed.
The aircraft was delivered to the United States Air Force in 1982 through 1990. Through most of that period, it was a program in secret that the United States Air Force kept from the public and the world.
The Nighthawk's distinctive angular lines make it undetectable by radar. The engine's exhausts are 2 rectangular slits located above its wings to reduce infrared emissions, and its distinctive faceting reduces radar detection.
Faceting is the use of flat panels to diffract radar signals. So radar energy, the radio energy from a radar, is diffracted in such a way that it doesn't return to the radar dish. Therefore, there's no radar return.
It has a radar signature smaller than a marble, but its angular, stealthy shape makes it inherently unstable in flight.
The aircraft has very poor aerodynamic qualities, so it needs a computer to fly it. It's essentially an unstable aircraft, not designed with aerodynamics in mind, but stealth in mind, and that was first and foremost.
And they showed me this F-117, the stealth fighter, the first one coming down the assembly line. And I looked at that airplane, I said, it'll never fly, but it'll sure make a nice tie tack.
The Nighthawk requires constant flight corrections from a computer to maintain flight.
The shape of the airplane does make you think that there's a lot of ones and zeros making that thing fly, and it has 4 computers that make the thing fly. Without those computers, the airplane won't fly.
The F-117 is silent, stealthy, and comes with a powerful sting in its tail. Armed with laser-guided bombs, it eliminates hardened ground targets with devastating efficiency. In 1991, the Nighthawk briefly emerges from the shadows when America announces its existence. The reason? Iraq's increasing defiance against the West. International tensions run high, but Iraq refuses to back down. Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein declares that he's preparing for the mother of all battles. The Nighthawk is about to play a crucial role.
On the 17th of January 1991, Desert Storm kicked off.
America's President Bush leads an international coalition to strike Iraq.
The F-117 was deployed in Operation Desert Storm primarily to attack strategic targets.
This was the Nighthawk's first real test. Was it truly battle-ready?
The F-117 Nighthawk really did receive a true baptism of fire during the Gulf War, when it was picked against some of the most highly defended targets on the planet.
The Nighthawk pilots lived up to their given name.
The call sign of F-117 pilots were bandits.
The F-117 fleet began their long journey from the US, finally landing in Saudi Arabia on the 20th of August after a grueling 15-hour non-stop flight.
The F-117 struck early in the morning on the 17th of January 1991, directly into Baghdad. And the intent is that using the stealth capability of the F-117, we could employ more stealth by taking out the eyes and ears of the Iraqi leadership.
Iraqi power stations, military headquarters and communication centers were all targeted and destroyed by the Nighthawk.
It had about a 900-mile combat radius that it employed from Saudi Arabia and attacked principally on the opening parts of the war in Baghdad. And then throughout the war, it continued to employ against command and control, strategic targets, nuclear, biological, chemical targets, and a lot of the hardened aircraft shelters. As a matter of fact, out of 600 aircraft shelters in Iraq, 375 of them were struck throughout the war by either 117s or F-111Fs.
It conducted 1,300 sorties and scored direct hits on 1,600 high-value targets, dropping 2,000 tons of precision-guided bombs.
It was able to drop bombs without anybody knowing they were coming. And so they unleashed not only surprise on the enemy, but they also had a psychological effect that the bombs were coming from nowhere.
The F-117 guys had the maxim, we own the night.
70 to 75% of the bombs were direct hits on the exact location, which was revolutionary in warfare.
The success of the F-117 was a game changer.
I personally think that the F-117 has revolutionized the way we employ air power in the 21st century. The F-117 was the first platform we used that allowed us to use stealth technology and precision-guided munitions in concert to achieve effects immediately in the battle space and to essentially blind the enemy leadership.
Stealth is an essential art of war. In the 5th century BC, the legendary Chinese battle general Sun Tzu used stealth as one of his key tactics. 26 centuries later, stealth planes follow his legendary doctrine. It's as dark and impenetrable as the night. It takes the enemy by surprise and strikes like a thunderbolt. Today, stealth is taking the form of unmanned drone aircraft, flown by pilots from the other side of the world, capable of launching attacks from 5 miles up. The future will see fully autonomous drones spying, surveying, and striking. Stealth began as the unseen spy in the sky. Now it's an essential part of aerial warfare. The next generation of jet fighters and bombers fitted with stealth technology, ready to attack under the cloak of invisibility.